We are so happy to be here with you today. We're going to continue our series in the book of Exodus. We're all the way up to chapter 18 today, where we're going to talk about a guy named Jethro. When I was getting ready for today, I was trying to think, do I know anybody in my friends or family circle named Jethro? I couldn't come up with anybody. Any of you have anybody in your family or your circle of friends that you know that's named Jethro? Anybody? Nobody. It's not a name that he has one. All right, there's always one. But it's not a name that we use in our culture very much anymore. But there is Google, right? So I Googled, and I came up with 3 Jethros you might know. So here's the first one. Anybody know this guy? His name is Jethro Pugh. He played for the Dallas Cowboys in the 60s and 70s. Must have been a pretty good player. He's in the Hall of Fame or whatever they call that for football. All right, how about this one? Anybody know? It's not actually a guy, it's a group of guys. Anybody know who that is? Music? Jethro Tull, yes. Again, you have to be like a child of the 60s or 70s to know that, but they had a lot of hits in the late 70s. Yes, young people, we used to dress like that. I actually have a jacket much like the guy on the right there when it was 1970 something or other. Anyway, all right, how about this next one? More people should know this one. Jethro Bodine, yes. Now, I was talking to some young people earlier today, and I mentioned Jethro Bodine, the Beverly Hillbillies. They're like, I don't know what you're talking about. They didn't know, come and listen to my story about a man named Jed, right? If you missed out on the Beverly Hillbillies, I feel sorry for you, because that was like a wonderful show. But anyway, Jethro Bodine. The Jethro we're talking about today is not like any of these 3 Jethros. The Jethro we're going to talk about today lived about 1,000 years before Jesus was even born. The first time that we see him is in the 2nd chapter of the book of Exodus. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in that chapter. Moses is born, Moses grows up, Moses realizes he's a Hebrew, he kills an Egyptian that's abusing one of his Hebrew brothers, and then he has to flee Egypt for his life. He ends up going to a land called Midian. I don't know about you, I'm kind of a visual person, so here's a map that helps a little bit to understand about where Moses was. So up in the top left corner, you see Egypt. That's where he grew up, right? He gets in trouble. He flees Egypt. He comes all the way across the Sinai Peninsula. That's like 300-mile trek that he made to get out of the territory controlled by Egypt. The Sinai was all Egyptian territory in that day and time. Remember, they're a world power. So he has to get beyond that in order to get out of harm's way. And he goes to this land called Midian, which oddly enough is named after a guy named Midian. Turns out Moses is actually related to the Midianites as well. I don't know if he knew that at the time that he went or not, but look at the heritage or the genealogy rather, of Abraham. All these guys are related to Abraham, right? So Abraham has 3 women that he has children by. The first is Sarah. Sarah has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob and Esau. Jacob later changes his name to Israel and becomes the father of the nation of Israel. So that's through Sarah's heritage. Hagar has Ishmael. Ishmael and Hagar end up leaving Abraham. They go out into the desert to live and form another tribe of people. And then he has a 3rd woman named Keturah. We don't know how many children she had. She had at least 6. They only recorded boys in those days. One of those boys is named Midian. And he's the father of this Midianite nation where Moses spends 40 years. He spends 40 years there because he would have been very comfortable in the Midianite culture. It's much like the culture that he grew up in Egypt. They would have known of the God of Abraham, but they didn't serve the God of Abraham. The Midianites were more like the Egyptians in that they had hundreds of gods. They had a god for the sun, the moon, the stars, the harvest, and all the rains, all these other gods that they would serve and worship. And so Moses would have felt very comfortable there until one day Moses meets the one true God up on the mountainside in the burning bush, like was just mentioned a moment ago, right? And that changes his life. That changes everything for Moses. His life is never the same, just like it's never the same for you and I once we meet the one true God. And so, we're going to go through quite a bit of scripture today. I'm trying to trim this down because I'm way going to be over, so I'm going to apologize to you up front. We're going to probably run over today. But when we catch up with Moses, he's already taken the people out of Egypt, and they've gone through the Red Sea, they've gone through the manna and the what do you call them, doves, and they've won their battles and victory and all those other things. All those miraculous things God has done for them. Now they're camped in the Sinai desert that you saw on that map right there, waiting for God to tell them what their next move should be. Now, if you just read chapter 18 right after chapter 17, you would think they just flow in succession, but they don't. Chapter 17, where you ended last week, they're only about 2 months outside of Egypt. Chapter 18, it flips over to about 2 years later, maybe a little bit even more than that, is when what we're going to read about today occurs. The Bible does that a lot because that's how the ancients used to write. They didn't write in sequence like we do today. They wrote in more topics. So you can be reading along in a chapter and all of a sudden they say, oh yeah, and there's this happened too. That's kind of what happened in our verses today. So we're going to be in the 18th chapter of the book of Exodus. Got to use my glasses because right now it looks like just a bunch of black and white. And we'll start with verse 1. We're going to take this a verse at a time because there is a ton of stuff in this chapter that's super important, and I just don't want to miss any of it. So, chapter 18, verse 1. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian and the father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything that God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. 3 things. We got to stop already, just for a minute. 3 things in this passage that you need to understand to give you more context of what's going to happen here. So the Bible calls him a priest. This word that's used there, it's a really ancient word. It hasn't been used for thousands and thousands of years. And the Bible interpreters didn't know what to do with it, so the best thing they could think of was to say the word priest. But when we are in our culture today, we hear priest, we think like in the Catholic Church, a priest like that. That's not what this is. He's more like a worship leader. Remember, they serve all these hundreds of gods. And so Jethro has a role in the worship of those gods in some way, shape, or form. Not a song leader, but a worship leader. He's got status in Midian, and that's important for you to know. He's a respected individual in their society. Also note that it mentions that he's the father-in-law of Moses. So how that happens is when Moses leaves Egypt, he flees to Midian. He comes upon a group of women that are feeding their flocks there. There's some men that are abusing them. Moses beats the guys off. The girls take him back home to their father-in-law, to their father. Their father's Jethro. And Moses ends up marrying Jethro's oldest daughter. Her name is Zipporah. But the most important thing in this verse is why Jethro came to Moses. It says that he came to Moses because he heard of all that God was doing in Moses' life and for the people of Israel, right? We've talked about this before. When the Bible uses, especially in the Old Testament, when the Bible uses the word heard, pay attention, because it's a different kind of word than what we think of today. When we think of the word heard, we think about the sound came into my ear. I heard it. But in the Bible, in the ancient literature, that word means much more. It's more of an action word. So it means, yes, the sound came into my ear, but it caused me to do something. It caused me to react. It caused me to take action and respond. And that's what Jethro is doing. He's heard about, in fact, the whole world has heard about what God is doing with Moses and with the Israelites and what he did in Egypt with all the plagues and all of that. And that's caused Jethro to take action. It's caused Jethro to want to know more about this God that Moses is now serving. And so he goes to Moses. And what's important about that is, you know what? People hear about your life too. They're listening to what you're doing in your life. They're watching what you're doing with your life. And we're called to live differently because of that, so that people can hear a message through how we live our life. It's why Jesus said in Matthew, there it is, 5:14. What did he say? He said, live your life like it's a light on a hill, right? A light that shines and tells everybody, I live differently, and there's a reason for that, so that people will want to know, why do you live differently? What do you do? What makes your life different? There's another quote I love. It comes from a guy named St. Francis. Not even sure that he's actually the guy that said this, but I still love the quote anyways. It says, what? How we live our lives tells people what we do. It's not about the words. People sometimes will say to me, well, I don't have the gift of testimony. I don't have the gift of witness. I can't share my faith with other people. Yes, you can. And yes, you do. You do every single day in the way that you live your life. That's what people will see. That's how they see Jesus. Because they see that you live differently and they say, there's something about that. What is it that I need to know? What do they know that I don't know? And that's why Jethro comes to see Moses, because he's heard about how God has changed Moses' life. Verse 2, after Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her. I'm going to stop there before we go to the next verse. So Moses meets God on the hill in the burning bush, right? And then he goes to Jethro, his father-in-law. He says, I'm going to take the family. We're going to go. God's called us to take the Israelites out of Egypt. Somewhere along the way, Moses gets in big trouble with God, big trouble. Zipporah steps up, saves the day. But a lot of Bible scholars think maybe right in there someplace, Moses thought, maybe this isn't a good idea, my wife and the kids coming to Egypt. This is not going to be as easy as I thought it might be. And so he sends them back to Jethro, and Jethro's been watching them. How long did I say he's been watching them? How long have they been out of Israel when this happens? Out of Egypt? 2 years. He's been watching them for 2 years. And now he's going to reunite them. Verse 3, and her 2 sons. One son was named Gershom, for Moses said, I have become an alien in a foreign land. And the other was named Eliezer, for he said, my father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh. In that day and time, in that culture, the father always named the children, just like they do in Africa today. It's always the father that names the children. And these names, they're significant names. The name that you get, that defines who you are as an individual for the rest of your life in these cultures. And so these names are significant. Notice that the first one, he names him, I'm an alien. And Moses is, right? He's left Egypt, he's in Midian, he's an alien in a foreign land. But the second one is the one that's really fascinating to me, because he names that son, basically the name means God has protected me. Moses doesn't know the God of Abraham yet. He hasn't met him on the mountainside yet. But he knows that Abraham's God has saved him from Egypt. He knows that Abraham's God has a purpose for his life. Even though he hasn't met him yet, he doesn't know what that purpose is, but he knows that God has a purpose for his life. And it's the same with you and I. God loves every single one of you. God has a purpose for every single one of you, for your life. Maybe you don't know what that purpose is right now, just like Moses didn't know. Maybe it's a difficult time that Moses is going through right now. But God has a purpose for your life. He has something he wants you to do, and he's preparing you for that, just like he did Moses. Verse 4. Let's go to verse 5. So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and wife, they came to him in the desert, where he was camped near the mountain of God. That's Mount Sinai. Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law, Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. So, just understand what's maybe a little bit more context here. Moses is 40 years old when he leaves Egypt. He's in Midian 40 years. How old is he when he goes to Egypt to take the people out? He's 80-some years old, right? So, just in context, because sometimes movies show it as Zipporah with these 2 little kids. These aren't little kids. And Zipporah's not young. This is a mature family that he's now bringing back to Moses. And Moses is no spring chicken either. Verse 7. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed down and he kissed him. And they greeted each other, and they went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way and how the Lord had saved them. So here's how I see this in my mind's eye. Moses sees Jethro coming with his family. Moses shows Jethro all the respect that he should show Jethro as an elder and as a person that is older than he is. Jethro is actually older than Moses, right? Moses goes out. He meets Jethro. He probably kneels down on the ground, head down. Jethro maybe says, "Arise, Moses." Moses stands up, and Jethro whispers into Moses' ear, "Moses, I want to know everything. I want to know what your God is doing in your life. I want to know who he is. I want to know what's all these stories I've heard. Tell me the whole thing." And they turn and they walk into Moses' tent, probably hand in hand. That's how people in Africa show respect for each other. Even today, men hold hands. It's not a gay thing. It's a I love you. It's an I respect you. You're my friend thing. And so they go into the tent, and Moses begins to tell Jethro everything. Tells him the whole story. Next verse. We'll go to verse 9. This is amazing. What happens next is really quite interesting and amazing. Jethro was delighted to hear all of the good things that the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. He said, "Praise be to God, to the Lord, who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued you from the people, rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who have treated Israel arrogantly." Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. Jethro, just like when Moses met God on the mountainside and in the burning bush, Jethro's life has now changed as well. He's now been converted. He is a believer in the one true God. He's a believer in I am that I am. And that's quite something for a guy his whole life who's been serving all these other gods. Now he believes in the one true God. Now there's people that say, "Nah, you're taking that out of context," because it doesn't say that. All it says is that he knows about the one true God. Even the devil knows about the one true God, right? But the Bible's our definitive source, but there's other historical documents we can use as well. And there's an ancient Jewish document called Mishra, there it is, that captures this same conversation between Moses and Jethro. And this is what they say Jethro said. "I've served many idols, but there's no God I've not served. None of them compares to the God of Israel." Jethro was converted that day. He became a follower of the one true God. But what's most important in that verse is what happens next. Once he becomes a follower, look what they did. They went and they worshiped in what? The presence of God. Don't miss that. That's super important. Because the Bible says when we worship together, I am that I am that I am, the one true God, is in your presence. This is the God that made the sun and the moon and the stars, the God that is now and will forever be, the God that's more powerful, more strong, more omniscient, we can't even imagine how awesome he is. And it says that when we worship together, like right now, he's in this room with us. We are in his presence. When you go home and you worship around your dining room table, he's there with you. When you go to your bedroom and you're you're reading the Bible, you're in the presence of God. He's here right now. We ought to probably all be on our faces in worship and praise of him and who he is. But let's go on. Verse 13, the next day, Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When Moses his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, what is this you're doing for the people? Why do you sit alone and judge while all these people stand around you from morning until evening? So just a quick review here. Again, my mind's eye, but here's how I see it. Moses and Jethro get up the next morning, and maybe they're having some toast and some tea, and Moses says, hey, Jethro, you want to go to work with me tomorrow? Jethro says, sure, let's do it. So they go, and Jethro watches Moses, probably sitting under a tree, while people come to him, one after the other, all day long, to settle their disputes. I can see it in my mind's eye because that's how it happens in the village in Africa as well. The chief will go sit under his judgment tree on Judgment Day, and people come, and he decides all the cases right then and there. He makes all the judgments. That's what Moses is doing, except the difference here, there's 1 million people. And Moses is deciding all of these cases for 1 million people. They come to him one after the other. Moses, his dog killed one of my chickens. What about this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth thing? I should get another chicken, right? Moses, his wife slapped my wife while they got into an argument at the well. I want something done about that. Moses, their goat has been in my tent 5 times. This time he ate every stick of manna we have. What am I supposed to do? Moses is deciding all of these cases himself, and Jethro can't believe it. He can't understand why is it that Moses is doing this. So he asked Moses, what the heck are you doing, Moses? Verse 13. Nope, we already did that one. Let's do, it is verse 15, rather. Moses answers him, because the people come to me and they seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and laws. Remember, they've been in the desert how long? 2 years. They don't have the laws yet. They have the 10 Commandments by this time, but they don't have all the other laws yet. So Moses, he is the law. He's right. He's the only one that can settle all of these disputes. And so that's what he's doing. And that's what he tells Jethro. Jethro's not buying it. This is going to be a long passage, so hang in there with me. Here we go, verse 17. Moses' father-in-law replied, what you're doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear themselves out. The work's too heavy for you. You can't handle all this alone. Listen to me now, and I'll give you some advice. And may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them the decrees and the laws and show them the way to live and the duties they're to perform, but select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. Have them serve as judges for all the people at all the times, but have them bring the very difficult cases to you. The simple cases they can decide for themselves. That will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you'll be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied. So there's a lot of debate on why Jethro would say these things to Moses. Some people think that Jethro thought, Moses is playing God. I mean, everybody's got to come to him. It's Moses and only Moses, right? Moses, I'm Moses. I will settle this. And he was offended by that. Maybe. Some people think that Jethro thought, oh, wait a minute, there's 1 million people. They're all in line. They're in the desert in the hot sun. This is not fair to any of these people. This shouldn't be happening. Maybe. Other people think that it was a sense of urgency issue, that Jethro thought, some of these cases have to be severe. I mean, maybe there's a murder case in there. Who knows? And they're having to wait days, maybe, to get to Moses, to get it resolved. That can't be. Doesn't really matter to me. Why he said it is not that significant. Who said it is. There's only probably 3 people in the whole world could say these words to Moses at this time in his life. Because in a culture like that, just like in Africa today, you don't tell the chief you're doing it wrong. You would never do that. Now, this isn't grumbling. The people do grumble all the time, but that's different. This time, Jethro's saying, Moses, you're doing it wrong. Jethro was one of 2 or 3 people that could say that to Moses, and he would listen. Look at what God's done. He took Moses out of Egypt, takes him to Midian, so that he can become the son-in-law of this man, Jethro, so that Jethro can come back and speak truth into Moses' life when he needs it. You ever had God do that for you? Bring somebody in your life to speak truth to you when you couldn't hear it from anywhere else? That's what's just happened here. And Moses listens. Let's go to the next verse. Verse 24. Moses listened to his father-in-law, and he did everything he said. He chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens, and they served as judges for the people at all times. The most difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. This might be the most important part of this entire passage. Moses heard what his father-in-law said to him, didn't he? And he took action, and he changed how he was doing things. Most people, when they teach on this particular passage, they'll park right there, and they'll park right there because they'll talk about, okay, you see how important it is to delegate? You see how one person can't put everything on his shoulders? You see how all of us have different talents, and if we work together, we can accomplish more? All of that leadership stuff, which is all important. But I think there's something else here. There's something else here that if we don't look below the surface a little bit, we'll miss. This is Moses we're talking about. This is Moses that when he first met God, he's so close to God that God says, dude, take your shoes off. You're in my house. This is Moses that talks to God like a man talks to God. Every day in Egypt, he's talking to God, and God's telling him, do this, do this, do this, say that, do this. He's that close with God. Since they left Egypt, they've been in the presence of God the entire time. God's in front of them, God's behind them. As long as they stay in God's presence, they're fine. When they get out of God's presence, they run into trouble. This is Moses that goes up on the mountain and talks to God on a daily basis. Sometimes when he comes down, he's been so close to God that his face is glowing because he's been in the presence of Almighty God. That's the Moses we're talking about. If anybody on this planet knows the value, how important it is to be in the presence and stay in the presence of God, it's Moses. And how is he spending his day? He's spending his day on all of this other stuff, and every bit of it's important. Every one of those issues is important to solve. He's got an important job to do. But I think when God sent Jethro to speak truth into Moses, that Moses realized all that stuff's important, but it's not most important. The most important thing I need to be doing is spending my time in the presence of God. The Bible talks about this all the time. It's all over the Bible, all different verses. It says, pray without ceasing. It tells us to abide in him. It tells us, seek first the kingdom, to draw near to God. It says, seek his presence continually. And I think that's what Moses realized. That's what he heard from Jethro's message. I love this quote as well. It's attributed to Martin Luther. I don't know if Martin Luther actually said it, but basically what he's saying is, holy smokes, I got 36 hours worth of work to do today. There's no way I can get it all done. There's only 24 hours in a day. I'm going to have to spend the first 3 hours in prayer. Confession. Gary could not have known when he gave me this passage today that this is the very thing God has been working on with me in my own life. Because I'm just as busy as you are. We all have our list, right? We have all of this stuff to do every single day. And what God's been working with me on is, Larry, if you just spend time with me first, I'll take care of the rest of that stuff. And on the days that I accomplish that, that's what he does. And that's what Moses does. He changes the way he's doing things so that he can spend time in the presence of God each and every day. greatest weapon that our enemy in the world we live in has against us is to keep us so busy that we don't spend time with God. It's his weapon of mass distraction. And we can't let that happen, people. We have to spend time with God every single day so that he can lead us where he wants us to go. And it's not easy. You have to work at it. I mean, think about Jesus. Jesus was a great example. Jesus, he'd go out in the morning early and pray. After a long day of ministry, he'd still be praying. He's praying all day long. And that's the kind of effort it takes. I'll just confess again, my own self, what I'm trying to do is everything I do all day long, I'm trying to pray about it. Every person I meet, every phone call I have, every conversation, I'm saying in my head, just not out loud normally, God, what do you want me to do here? God, what do you want me to say here? God, what do you want me to feel here? God, what do you want me to share with this person? We have to stay in the presence of God. And that's what Moses does, and it changes his life, just like it'll change your life. It'll change my life if we spend our time in the presence of God. All right, our chapter ends with verse 27. Then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. You would think, on the surface, if you just read that verse, you would think that Moses said, bye, Jethro, see you later, and off he goes. But that's not what happened. If we had time, we would look in the book of Numbers, and we could see that Jethro actually stays with Moses another 2 years, because Jethro knows this territory, and so he helps Moses lead the people toward the promised land. If we had more time, we could look in the book of Judges, where in chapter 1, I think it is, it lists all of the people that are living in Israel at the time of the Judges. And listed in there is a group of people who are Midianites, who have now come to live with Israel. When Jethro does go home, he shares with his people everything that he's learned, everything that he's seen, all that he's done, and who the real God is. And many of those people become followers of I Am That I Am. And now they're living with Israel. So that's our story today. It's really an amazing story. It's a story of how God uses people to speak into our lives, a story of how important it is to stay in the presence of God. And I hope that's what you've heard today. I hope that you have heard how important it is to stay in the presence of God in your own life. Because it's the most important thing any of us can do with these lives that God has given to us. Amen? Amen. Amen.